On December 17, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel David Perran, commander of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, stood in Malmedy, Belgium, facing a crisis. The German Ardennes Offensive had begun, catching the American First Army completely off guard. Leading the German breakthrough was Kampfgruppe Peiper, a formidable force of 5,000 Waffen-SS soldiers, 117 tanks, including 45 massive Tiger IIs, commanded by Joachim Peiper. Their mission was simple: punch through to Antwerp, cut the Allied armies in half, and win the war. American infantry divisions were in chaos, and armored units were scrambling. Peiper was moving faster than predicted, already capturing American fuel and supplies. No one was in position to stop him, except Perran and his 600 engineers, men trained to build, not fight tanks. They carried rifles and grenades, but their main weapons were C4 explosives, detonator wire, and technical knowledge. The situation was brutal. First Army had lost 2,300 men in the first 6 hours. Divisions were being torn apart or ceasing to exist as fighting forces. Peiper's lead elements were racing toward 3 crucial bridges, Habemont, Stavelot, and Trois Ponts, along narrow forest roads. If he secured those crossings, his Tigers would break into open country with nothing between them and the Meuse River, and nothing between the Meuse and Antwerp. Perran realized the rugged, heavily forested Ardennes terrain was their only advantage. The Germans absolutely needed intact bridges. His radical decision was to blow every single bridge before the Germans reached it. Not during a firefight, but before the panzers arrived, calculating the timing precisely, wiring the charges, and waiting until the last possible moment. It was a suicide mission. Engineers would be exposed targets, working on visible bridges as 5-ton Tigers rolled into view. Other officers called the plan reckless, suggesting they fall back and let the infantry or armor handle Peiper. But Perran ignored the criticism. His men were trained in bridge demolition. They knew exactly where to place charges to drop a span. The only question was their nerve. The first test came at Habemont, a small stone bridge over the Meuse River. Lieutenant Bucky Walters and 23 men wired the charges and retreated to a covered position 50 yards away. At 7:42 a.m., German reconnaissance vehicles appeared, followed by the first Tigers. Walters watched through binoculars, counting vehicles, estimating the distance. At 100 yards, then 50, his men urged him to blow the bridge. But Walters waited until the lead German half-track reached the western edge of the bridge. He squeezed the detonator. The center span lifted 6 feet and collapsed. The half-track dropped into the gap, crashing 20 feet below. Walters and his team pulled back, having bought First Army perhaps 30 minutes or even an hour. Every minute mattered. But Peiper did not stop. His column turned south, racing toward Trois Ponts, a larger crossing with 2 critical bridges over the Meuse and Somme rivers. The town was defended by a single squad of 12 engineers commanded by Sergeant Billington. Perran ordered Billington to use every pound of C4 on both bridges and destroy them the instant German lead elements appeared. Billington's men worked frantically, using twice the normal amount of C4 on the concrete and steel Meuse bridge and drilling holes in the keystone positions of the older stone arch bridge. Both were ready by 9:15 a.m. German tanks appeared at 9:38 a.m. Billington waited until the lead Tiger was just 30 yards from the Meuse bridge and triggered the demolition. The blast was enormous, disintegrating the center section. The Tiger stopped. Peiper himself reportedly climbed out, stared at the American position, and began laughing. Not in anger, but in disbelief. Pointing at the destroyed bridge, he spoke the words that became famous throughout the 6th Panzer Army. Those damned engineers. Those damned engineers. The engineers who were not supposed to be combat troops were delaying the entire northern thrust of Hitler's last offensive. Peiper turned south again, seeking a third option, a smaller, likely undefended bridge at Poteau, Neuf-Mullah. Perran moaned of the movement at 10 a.m. Lieutenant John Kirkpatrick and 19 men had explosives, but needed at least 45 minutes to wire the bridge, and Peiper would arrive in 30. The math did not work. Kirkpatrick would be on the bridge setting charges when the first Tiger appeared. Perran ordered him to do it anyway. A partially demolished bridge was better than an intact crossing. Kirkpatrick's men reached Poteau at 10:15 a.m. and began wiring the simple steel truss span. They worked against the roar of approaching German vehicles. By 10:30 a.m., they had placed 8 charges, half of what was needed. As the first German scout car, a Schwimmwagen, came into view just 50 yards away, Kirkpatrick triggered the charges. 6 of the 8 charges fired. The bridge twisted and dropped 10 feet. Damaged and dangerously unstable, but technically still standing. Peiper would have to send his pioneer company forward for repairs, delaying the column for hours instead of minutes. But it was still a critical delay. By noon on December 17th, Kampfgruppe Peiper had traveled less than 15 miles. The operational plan called for 60 miles on the first day. Peiper was 45 miles behind schedule. 3 demolished bridges, multiple detours, and constant rerouting were killing the German offensive. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion was fighting a defensive action without firing more than a few dozen rifle shots. Their weapons were explosives, timing, and technical knowledge, and it was working. Peiper's frustration was clear in his radio requests for intelligence and air reconnaissance. Perran, however, faced his own problem. His explosives were running out. By midday, they had used over half their initial 4,000 pounds of C4. With supply convoys stuck in chaos behind the lines, Perran ordered his men to scavenge explosives from abandoned positions and minefields. This improvised resupply bought them enough material for a few more bridges. The German advance continued. Peiper captured Stavelot at 4:30 p.m., where American engineers, hesitant to detonate while friendly vehicles were escaping, only partially destroyed the bridge. German engineers reported it repairable within 2 hours. Peiper split his force into 3 separate thrusts, looking for a weak point. One northern detachment captured a small bridge intact at Francorchamps, but the route was secretly mined. 2 German vehicles hit mines, disabling them and stalling the northern thrust. The south thrust, toward Liane Creek, found every crossing demolished, with the steep banks of the Liane Creek preventing the Tigers from fording. That left the main column, still pushing from Stavelot. They advanced 4 miles before encountering an American roadblock. 40 engineers of A Company with rifles and 2 Browning machine guns. They held their position, cutting down German infantry and disabling half-tracks with concentrated fire. When flanking movements forced them to withdraw, they pulled back to a secondary position, leaving behind a massive, prepared demolition buried in the road itself. 1,500 pounds of explosives. A Tiger tank rolled over it. The resulting 15-foot deep, 30-foot wide blast crater destroyed the tank and made the road completely impassable. Peiper was now 12 hours into his offensive, having advanced only 22 miles, 48 miles behind his operational schedule. His fuel was critically low, and everywhere he turned, there were more American engineers, more destroyed bridges, more delays. At 7 p.m., Peiper received new orders to maintain momentum and reach the Meuse within 24 hours, but he could not. He made the decision to halt for the night to consolidate and rest his exhausted men. Perran, however, used the darkness for preparation. His companies moved into new positions, wired more bridges, and planted more mines. At 10 p.m., Perran received his first resupply convoy, 1,800 pounds of C4 and 600 pounds of TNT, enough for perhaps 10 more bridges. The casualty reports came in, 11 men killed and 37 wounded. Perran calculated they could hold out for 3 or 4 more days. 3 days to stop the largest German offensive in the West since 1940. At 3 a.m. on December 18th, Peiper resumed his advance toward Le Glaise. But C Company of the 291st, led by Lieutenant Harold Parker, was already there, having wired the bridge and mined the approaches. At 4:30 a.m., Peiper sent infantry forward to probe. They found the town seemingly abandoned and radioed for the Tigers to advance. The lead tank was 200 yards away when Parker opened fire, forcing the infantry to cover. He let the Tigers close the distance, 50 yards, and then the bridge was obliterated. Peiper, reportedly in that lead tank, watched his offensive disintegrate bridge by bridge. By dawn on December 18th, Kampfgruppe Peiper had been stopped at 6 different locations: Habimond, Trois-Ponts, Poteau, Stavelot, Francochamps, and L'Église. Peiper had one last option, a small, minor bridge at Chenoy, which he hoped the Americans had overlooked. But Perran had anticipated this. Lieutenant Frank Ray and 14 men of B Company reached Chenoy at 5:45 a.m., driving without headlights on icy roads. German vehicle noise was audible as they placed 6 charges on the stone arch bridge. At 6:12 a.m., the entire weight of Kampfgruppe Peiper, Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, rolled toward the crossing. Ray waited until 3 Panther tanks were on the span to maximize the effect. The blast was massive, collapsing the arch, dropping all 3 Panthers 30 feet into the river, where they burst into flames. Ray and his men escaped through the back of a barn without casualties. By noon on December 18th, Peiper was trapped. His fuel was exhausted, his vehicles immobilized, and his force was contained by the 82nd Airborne, the 30th Infantry, and the 7th Armored Divisions. Without Peiper's breakthrough in the north, the entire German offensive was failing. On December 17th, an SS patrol from Kampfgruppe Peiper massacred 80 captured American soldiers from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion near Malmedy. When the 291st learned of the atrocity, their motivation changed. This was no longer just about delaying a military operation. It was about stopping war criminals. By December 21st, Kampfgruppe Peiper was finished, out of fuel and ammunition, surrounded. Peiper abandoned his equipment, including all his Tigers and Panthers, and led his surviving men on foot through American lines. The most powerful German battle group in the Ardennes Offensive had been destroyed, largely by 600 combat engineers who refused to let them cross a single bridge intact. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation for their actions from December 17th to December 26th, specifically recognizing the bridge demolitions that delayed the German breakthrough. Perran was promoted to full colonel. 3 months later, the 291st was called upon again. On March 7, 1945, the 9th Armored Division had captured the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine River at Remagen, the last major natural barrier protecting the German heartland before the Germans could completely destroy it. Thousands of troops and vehicles were pouring across the damaged structure, which engineers warned could collapse at any time. Perran received orders on March 8th. The 291st was to build a full tactical treadway bridge across the Rhine at Remagen within 48 hours. The Rhine was 900 feet wide at Remagen. The bridge required 32 inflatable rubber pontoons, steel sections, and anchoring systems. This would be the longest tactical bridge built under fire in the European theater. The engineers began work on March 9th at 8:30 a.m. German artillery fire began 30 minutes later. The engineers worked in the 38-degree water, fighting the 7-mile-per-hour current, ignoring the shelling. At 1 p.m., Luftwaffe Stukas and Me-26 jets bombed the construction site. Men were thrown into the river, but the work continued through air attacks and casualties. The pace was too slow, so Perran called for reinforcements. The arrival of 2 additional treadway companies accelerated the work. German shelling and searchlights continued throughout the night, forcing the battalion to accept visibility for vulnerability to maintain speed. A direct hit at 3 a.m. destroyed 4 pontoons, setting construction back 2 hours. By dawn on March 10th, the bridge stretched 700 feet, with the final, most exposed 200 feet remaining. Lieutenant Harold Dawson led the final connection team. At 10 a.m. on March 10th, the final connection was made. The 1,132-foot floating bridge was complete, built in 32 hours under constant fire. The longest tactical bridge constructed during World War II. First Army immediately began moving vehicles across. The Ludendorff's bridge collapsed on March 17th, killing 28 engineers who were working on repairs. But by then, the new treadway bridge was handling all traffic. Over 125,000 American troops crossed the Rhine at Remagen, secured the bridgehead, and drove deep into Germany. The war in Europe ended 8 weeks later. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion completed 73 bridges during the war, 19 under enemy fire, cleared 7,000 mines, and demolished 6 bridges to stop German advances. They were the most decorated combat engineer battalion in the European theater. Colonel David Perran returned to civilian life and died in 2012. His legacy lives on, a reminder that sometimes the most important weapon is not a rifle, but timing, technical knowledge, and the courage to stand your ground when tanks are approaching.